Out. Now, for our next speaker, I mentioned him earlier. I feel like I should fall to my knees when I call someone Lord. And perhaps he may suggest that a monarchy, a rising monarchy, is a good thing outside the climate sphere, maybe even inside the climate sphere in a different direction. But I'll say, we're Americans, maybe we'll stay away from the monarchy. But regardless, Christopher Monckton. Now let me see if I get this title correct. Christopher Monckton, 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley. I got it right, fantastic. Christopher Monckton has been making a positive difference in this world for decades. He was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. In addition to the various other topics he's addressed, when he came to suspect that there was something rotten in the climate alarmist narrative, Christopher Monckton dedicated his immense intellectual capacities and his efforts and his energies into getting to the heart of the matter and communicating it to people. Christopher Monckton has been excellent in that regard. He also has the distinction of being one of the few people to be kicked out and banned from the United Nations Conference of the Parties events. And I'll have to say, you look quite good in Arab garb. Christopher Monckton has, in addition to presenting common sense analysis, it gets to the heart of the flaws in alarmist theory. He has also worked closely with scientists at the top of the field to ascertain and deliver to people what the heart of climate sensitivity is likely to be. It's still an area where we need more information. What precisely is the climate sensitivity of our atmosphere to carbon dioxide? There are so many factors. His work on this has been tremendous. He published a paper a few years ago with, I believe it was Willie Soon and Matt Briggs. Fantastic paper. Excuse me? David Legates, who spoke earlier. And he's been working on his research since then. And I look forward to hearing what the latest you have to present on this. So may I present the United Nations delegate from the nation of Myanmar, Lord Christopher Monckton.
My lords, distinguished professors, doctors, and fathers of science, honorable members of both houses of Congress, ladies, gentlemen, and rebellious colonials. As you will have heard from James Taylor in his wonderfully generous introduction, so good was it, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. He did say that he wondered whether or not it was time for monarchy once again and aristocracy once again. My answer to you to this is in 2 words: we're back. And I can offer to you, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, the following arrangement. If you will end your rebellion and agree once again to be governed from as far away as possible, namely the other side of the Atlantic, by the spectacularly competent governments that you have seen of late in the United Kingdom, then we will agree to remit all of your taxes, imposts, and charges, save only for a single tax of £0.50 a pound on tea, provided that this time you put the tea not in the harbour but in the teapot. It does taste better that way. And I also have a few words for Jay Lear, who made much of the fact that he has done 1,500 skydives, and I have, alas, only done 1. Well, you see, Jay is a very, very slow learner. I only had to conduct the experiment once, in order to satisfy myself to a sufficient degree of confidence that if you throw yourself to the ground, you won't miss. With my usual reticence, diffidence, modesty, humility, and general laid-backness, I have entitled this talk, "The Very Last Talk on Global Warming That You Will Ever Need to Hear." Now, it is going to be technical, but not very. And I'm going to raise this question: what if the entire climate scare was based on a single scientific mistake? Well, it was. It was based on a single, serious, significant error of physics, which explains why global warming predictions were wild enough to conjure up a supposed climate emergency. Some of you have heard the earlier stages of our research before, but bear with me for the sake of the others while I run through them again. But at the end, I shall deal with one or two outstanding questions which were raised as a result of my former presentations here on this subject, and we think that our research may now be complete. But I see three of the most eminent climate scientists on the planet sitting on the table in front of me, glaring at me with their bright, intelligent eyes. So I am trembling in trepidation to see whether they think that we've done it or not. Well, this error I'm going to talk about was found by these handsome people you see on the screen now, many of whom I'm glad to say here today. And what we're going to do is to put this idea forward for your consideration as quickly as we can, but also as comprehensively as we can. And then, if you do not find any serious error or omission from what we're putting forward, we are going to propose that a letter should go from the Heartland Institute, or preferably even from the Trump administration, to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to activate its error reporting protocol so that they are made to consider what you are so willing to consider here today. So if we are not told by the eminent scientists here today, and we have, of course, the greatest of all climate scientists, Professor Richard Lindzen. Can we give him a round of applause? If there are any errors in my presentation, they are my fault. If there are any merits in my presentation, they come from the many generous conversations in which he has been willing to explain patiently to this idiotic layman asking silly questions how climate science hangs together. I'm profoundly grateful to him and profoundly pleased that all four of our laureates today, including him, have been recognized in the way that they have by the Heartland Institute. Well, now my team consists of professors of climatology, control theory and statistics, an award-winning Harvard-Smithsonian astrophysicist, an MIT Doctor of Physics, 2 control engineers, a nuclear engineer, an expert on the global electricity industry, an environmental consultant who used to sell wind farms until he thought better of it, and 1 Renaissance man. Now, nobody pays us a dime to do our research. We do it because we are curious. We wondered in particular why so many official predictions had so egregiously overshot. We wondered why, for instance, the great pause in global warming had lasted for so long. In 2015, Joe Bass sent this slide to Senator Cruz, who displayed it at a Senate hearing, to the discomfiture of the Democrats. Joe, thank you for your decades of leadership at the Heartland Institute. We wish you and Diane a long and characteristically active retirement. The pause demonstrated that global warming would be much slower than we'd been told. The warming rate, in fact, from 1850 to 2011, the year to which data were updated for the IPCC's 5th assessment report, was only 1/3 of the medium-term rate predicted by the IPCC in 1990. We wondered why. Net estimated man-made forcing to 2011 in the IPCC's 2013 report was 2.5 watts per square metre. Radiative imbalance was 0.6 watts per square metre, the warming that hadn't quite come through as a result of the forcing. Models' implicit estimate, therefore, of the system gain factor, also called the closed-loop gain, that converts direct or reference warming or sensitivity before you take account of feedback to equilibrium or final warming after feedback is just 1.3, not the currently imagined 3.2. Now, these values imply that expected Charney sensitivity, and that's the final or equilibrium warming after feedback has acted in response to doubled CO2, will be just 1.4 degrees, which is 1.3 times the 1.05 degree currently estimated pre-feedback or reference warming or sensitivity from or to doubled CO2. I'm sorry that these terms are such gobbledygook, but these are the ones they use. Yet Model's 3.35 degree mid-range headline prediction is 2.4 times the value that their own data for forcing and radiative imbalance would lead them to expect. The contradiction between their expectation based on their data on the one hand and their outlandishly extreme mid-range estimate on the other of Charney sensitivity is, as you see on this slide, substantial. We wondered why Models had thus egregiously failed the first Popperian test for verification of a scientific hypothesis, self-consistency. In 2013, IPCC, realizing that its medium-term predictions had greatly overshot, quietly halved them. Yet IPCC refused at the same time, and still does refuse, to reduce its long-term global warming predictions. Its estimated equilibrium final or long-term Charney sensitivity interval remains 1.5 to 4.5 degrees, just as it was in the Charney report originally in 1979, exactly 40 years ago. Billions spent, nothing changed. We wondered why. Predicted estimates of Charney sensitivity range from 1.5 degrees at the bottom end of the IPCC's range to 4.7 degrees, the top end of the Model's range. And that's an enormous interval of 3.2 degrees. Yet they call this settled science. We wondered why. Models predict that in the mid-troposphere, specific humidity, the water vapor 6 miles up, that's the green arrow there, will increase with warming, but it has fallen. Yet they still predict rapid warming. We wondered why. The tropical hotspot is the warming at approximately double the tropical surface rate that models predict in response to their imagined increase in specific humidity in the mid-troposphere, 6 miles up in the tropics. The hotspot is absent in reality because the additional water vapor to drive it isn't there. So water vapor feedback and hence global warming must be small, yet models say they will be large. We wondered why. Specific humidity is rising at the Clausius-Clapeyron rate of 7% per degree of global warming, but only in the lower troposphere where it doesn't matter because water vapor's spectral lines are there near saturated. As humidity increases, only the far wings at that altitude add to infrared absorption, which varies in any case logarithmically with specific humidity. So you don't expect a strongly exponential response, feedback response to water vapor. We wondered what had caused this train wreck of almost entirely unreported predictive exaggerations. What had gone wrong? We wondered whether a systemic error of physics had caused the large exaggerations in predicted against observed and significantly against expected warming. Any error, we reasoned, would probably lie in models' treatment of feedback response, the extra warming driven by feedback processes modifying a pre-existing temperature. In models' mid-range estimates and the IPCC's too, the feedback response multiplies the 1.05 degree direct greenhouse gas warming on the left there by 3. And the extreme papers by up to 10. But since mid-range predicted warming is 3 times the observed warming, we hypothesized that misunderstanding of feedback might explain the exaggerated predictions. Feedback is an indirect forcing in response not only to reference sensitivity, that's the direct warming caused by greenhouse gases, but also to reference temperature, the entire temperature before accounting for feedback. Reference temperature is the sum of the emission temperature that would obtain at the surface without any greenhouse gases or feedbacks and all reference sensitivities to greenhouse gases. Water vapor Water vapor feedback is partly offset by lapse rate feedback. IPCC reckons all feedbacks except water vapor feedback self-cancel. So in effect, its mid-range estimate is that water vapor feedback approximately triples the direct or reference greenhouse gas warming. But the very same feedbacks respond to the emission temperature because the sun is shining, as to the greenhouse gas warming because the use of today's albedo in deriving emission temperature implies that at that temperature most of the planet would be ice-free, allowing the feedbacks to operate much as they do and much to the same degree as they do today. In 2015, a paper by us in the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences showed how simple models could answer the how much warming question. That year, we published a further paper indicating that climatology appeared not to be handling feedback correctly, though we had not then identified the error. We asked for help in tracking it down. And sure enough, climatologists had indeed made a mistake. They had defined climate feedback as responding to changes in temperature, but had neglected also to say that feedback also responds to the entire reference temperature, specifically including the emission temperature that would obtain even without greenhouse gases or feedbacks, simply because the sun is shining, except in Scotland, of course. Now, climatologists had forgotten the sunshine. Models assume feedbacks don't respond to the 255 degree Kelvin emission temperature, but do respond to just 10 degrees of direct warming from the pre-industrial non-condensing greenhouse gases, the condensing greenhouse gas water vapor being treated quite correctly as a feedback. Now that is a scarcely believable contradiction, that on the one hand 255 degrees produces no feedback and 10 degrees produces a feedback double itself. So extraordinary is this that I'm going to prove it to you, that that is what their mid-range estimates directly imply. Now the top calculation on this slide shows you what the natural greenhouse effect is. It's about 33 Kelvin. But the bottom calculation shows that if you take the product of the system gain factor of 3.2, which is their mid-range system gain factor at the moment, and the 10-degree reference sensitivity to the pre-industrial non-condensing greenhouse gases is also about 33 degrees. And what that means is that at present emission temperature is implicitly assumed to cause no feedback response at all. Now, this is a significant and untenable contradiction. The model's currently estimated feedback response to the 10-degree pre-industrial greenhouse gas warming is more than twice that warming, yet their implicit feedback response to the 255-degree emission temperature, 25 times the 10-degree greenhouse warming to 1850, is zero. That is a manifest impossibility and an absurdity. Climatology has, in effect, loaded all of the large feedback response to the sunshine onto greenhouse gases. That is why it has greatly exaggerated the system gain factor and hence all its global warming predictions. Feedback block diagrams come from control theory, the branch of engineering physics from which climatologists borrowed feedback analysis without understanding it. They ignored the input from the sun. That's their central error. Follow the arrows. Greenhouse warming is fed by them into the feedback loop, which modifies it. But in reality, the feedback loop must modify the entire temperature it finds at any given moment, not merely natural or man-made changes in that temperature. This is a fundamental and elementary principle of control theory which has escaped a lot of climatologists. Now, in the corrected block diagram, emission temperature is the input signal, as it should be. The feedback loop cannot possibly, just look at this diagram to see this, it cannot respond to the 10-degree direct greenhouse gas warming that was there in 1850, or the 1-degree greenhouse gas warming that we have caused since before counting of feedback, without responding in much the same degree to the 255-degree emission temperature that is 25 times larger than itself. The feedback loop can't pick and choose which part of the reference temperature that it modifies. It must modify the entire reference temperature. Like Luther, it can do no other. Ich kann nicht anders. Now, block diagrams are one up on equations in that the arrows show the direction of causality, but they don't show the relative magnitudes of the quantities concerned. This diagram fixes that. The pale yellow zone is emission temperature, and the thickness of that zone is proportional to its contribution to the temperature in 2011. The pale yellow zone above it to top right is emission temperature's feedback, and feedback response, I should say, and the narrow band above that bright yellow band at top right represents all natural and man-made warmings and the feedback responses thereto up to 2011. The sun visibly dominates the entire system. Now we're in a position to correct climatology's error, and in doing so, we're going to find ourselves dividing global warming by 3, resolving the inconsistencies not only between prediction on the one hand and both observation and expectation on the other, but also between the feedback responses to emission temperature and to greenhouse gas warming. And we shall narrow the interval of Charney sensitivity for the first time in 40 years. The equilibrium and reference temperatures in 1850, before we had made much impact on the climate, are well constrained. Their ratio, just 1.085, is the system gain factor, and not the currently implicit 3.2. Charney sensitivity, then, is 3.35 degrees as they now have it, and we say no, it's a third of that, or about 1.15 degrees. And that ends the climate problem, but. And this but comes from Roy Spencer. He says, what if the system gain factor is not invariant with temperature? What if it goes up with temperature? How are you going to deal with that, Monckton? Well, for the first time, here's how. And here's what we do. We first of all define unit feedback response as feedback response per degree of emission temperature or of greenhouse gas warming. We have hitherto assumed that the unit feedback responses to emission temperature and to direct greenhouse gas warming to 1850 are identical because, for good reason we assume this, the 255-degree emission temperature so dominates the climate system. It represented, in fact, 89% of that year's equilibrium temperature, and the 265-degree reference temperature in 1850 was 92% of equilibrium temperature. IPCC in 2001 joins us in assuming near invariance. It calls the climate sensitivity parameter, which among other things embodies feedback response, as a near invariant parameter. IPCC in 2013 goes one better. It takes the feedback parameter itself as invariant. These statements imply that system gain factors and thus unit feedback responses will likewise be invariant or nearly so over time and temperature. But we checked. We calculated the system gain factors predicted, or rather in predicted 21st century forcing and warming over 10-year periods under IPCC's wildly extreme RCP 8.5 scenario. The system gain factor increases by only 1/6 over 300 years, even after an absurd 8 degrees of predicted warming over the period. On the less unreasonable RCP 6.0 scenario, the variance over a century is less than 1/10. So can we use the knowledge that feedback responds not only to those changes in the initial temperature, but also to about the same degree to emission temperature itself to cap Charney sensitivity? Well, to borrow a phrase from your former president, yes, we can. In 1850, observed temperature of 287.5 degrees was at or close to equilibrium. There would be no trend in that temperature for 80 years. That temperature is the sum of the 4 boxes in the middle of this slide. The 255-degree emission temperature, its feedback response, the 10-degree reference sensitivity to the greenhouse gases in 1850, and its feedback response. Now, those are not to scale. Now, models emit the feedback response to emission temperature, the leftward red box, and they dump all of its contents in the rightward red box. The 3 highlighted quantities are all well constrained. We know what they are pretty much to within a degree or two. All other quantities shown are derived therefrom by very straightforward means. The how much warming question therefore boils down simply to this: what is the correct apportionment of the 22.5-degree feedback response in 1850 between emission temperature from the sun on the left there and the pre-industrial greenhouse gases? How much goes into each of the 2 red boxes? If we know that, we can tell the local slope of the equilibrium sensitivity response function in 1850, and we know that because there's only going to be a little change from 1850 until a doubling of CO2 compared with 2011, that local slope will be pretty much the right estimate for final Charney sensitivity to be calculated from. So we studied that question by deriving the feedback impact ratio, or X factor, which is simply a measure of how much more feedback response there was per degree of pre-industrial greenhouse gas warming to 1850 than there was per degree of emission temperature. The X factor is defined as the ratio of the unit feedback responses to pre-industrial greenhouse gas warming to 1850 and to emission temperature. We express the X factor, using a little bit of algebra, in terms of a single unknown, the system gain factor, A sub 0, in response to pre-industrial greenhouse gas warming. Then we plot the X factor against the system gain factor, which, since it is invariant, the X factor cannot realistically exceed, shall we say, 2, let's be generous and say 3. And even that would imply that feedback somehow responded 3 times more energetically to greenhouse gas warming than to emission temperature. And here then, ladies and gentlemen, is the money graph. This is the real doom for the climate doomsters. But what it shows is that even at the 1.5 degree lower bound of IPCC's Charney sensitivities, that's on the left just below the Heartland leaf there, you can see that the X factor comes out as 6. And that means that there will be 6 times as much feedback response to the greenhouse gases that were there in 1850 than to the emission temperature. If you go a little bit further to the right, just to 1.7 Kelvin of Charney sensitivity, just a little bit above their current bottom end estimate, then it's an order of magnitude more feedback response to the greenhouse gases than to emission temperature. Go to the right-hand end of the graph, and at an imagined Charney sensitivity of 2.9 Kelvin or Celsius, then the X factor becomes 100. By 2 orders of magnitude, the feedback response to greenhouse gases would have to react to, rather than to the emission temperature. It would be 100 times more. And there is no, and I assure you we've looked very hard, there is no plausible physical process anywhere in the climate that can give you so large a differential between the unit feedback responses to greenhouse gases and to emission temperature. That there can be some differential is undeniable. That it could be on anything like the scale of some of the figures you see on this graph is also, that's impossible. It can't happen. So the system gain factor grows so slowly with the X factor because once you do a bit more math and express it the other way around, the emission temperature ends up being added to both the equilibrium and reference sensitivities, top and bottom of the fraction there, which represents the system gain factor, and that has a powerful effect in damping the system response. Now, this curve, plotted on a different basis, is simply a straightforward plot of Charney sensitivity against feedback fractions, or loop gains, and the system gain factors, or closed-loop gains. The curve is a rectangular hyperbola, first studied by Menachmus of Alopekonissos in about 380 BC, which is how I know about it. I remember it well. That is why climatology cannot constrain equilibrium sensitivities, because it assumes that feedback multiplies the original direct warming many times over. But we have just proven that that is impossible. Now, it remains only to calculate the true uncertainty interval of Charney sensitivities, the standard metric for global warming studies. Now, our professor of statistics, Matt Briggs, known and loved to you all, concluded from a 300,000 trial Monte Carlo simulation that to 95% confidence the Charney sensitivity interval is just 1/7 of a degree, ranging from 1.09 to 1.23 degrees with a mid-range of 1.16 degrees. And there you see the Gaussian distribution comes out very beautifully from his calculations. Now, this entire interval or range of global warmings falls below the very lowest estimate made by the models. Professor Briggs, who is very diligent, also carried out another 300,000 trial Monte Carlo simulation, this time for models' Charney sensitivity interval, and that's the pink thing that dribbles along the bottom of the graph there. The models have no idea how much global warming there will be, and their entire sprawling interval of guesswork is excessive. It's over the top. So our result then, which is the pale green band, this is where we think Charney sensitivity is consistent both with expectation, the orange cursor to the right of it, and with observation, the dark green cursor to the left of it. The models, the red cursor being their mid-range, are way out of court. They had borrowed the physics of feedback from control theory without understanding it, and therefore the modelers hadn't realized that this constraint on Charney sensitivity existed. The models don't actually use feedback mathematics directly. They do it all by comparing states of the climate in time steps on an enormous three-dimensional lattice. It's very, very complex. But what this simple analysis does is to show that the more complex analyses done by the models must be incorrect. The bottom line then is that global warming will be small, slow, harmless, and net beneficial. There is no case, rational, scientific, political, economic, social, moral, or other, for any mitigation of global warming. It's over. To climatologists, I say this: sorry guys, you were wrong. You screwed up. To IPCC, I say this: we're going to activate that error protocol. We want you to look at this with an open mind and tell us whether we are right or whether we are right. To the Republicans, I say this with confidence: you can make Alexandria barkeep again. To the Democrats, I say this: your war on coal, oil, and gas kicks America's working people in the teeth. Your job-destroying, economy-trashing, tax-raising Green New Deal is founded not upon objective truth, but upon political expediency, social convenience, scientific ignorance, and financial profit. Scrap it. To the workers of America, such as the 100,000 noble mine workers whom I had the honor to address live on a mountaintop in West Virginia on Labor Day some years ago, I say this: those whose declared ambition is to destroy your livelihoods have no legitimate scientific cause to throw you or your great industries on the scrap heap. They do not deserve and should not receive your support. In 2020, vote them out. To the Vice-Chancellor, who, hearing of our result, called his entire 65-strong environmental sciences faculty together and yelled at them that this catastrophe must be refuted, I say this: it's not a catastrophe. As Matt Briggs points out, it's good news. And you cannot and you shall not any longer suppress or silence the truth for profit. To the universities that have no platform, those of us who do not share their narrow, sullen, illiberal, anti-scientific, totalitarian prejudices, I say this: restore freedom of speech, thought, research, inquiry, and action on campus, or forfeit your title, your status, and your funding as universities. We will revoke your charters. To the snowflake millennials propagandized at school and at university, I say this: the global warming policies you naively advocate are killing tens of millions of people a year in developing countries denied access to electrical power. It is we, the truth speakers, not you, the pusillanimous, bleating mouthpieces of totalitarianism, who hold the moral high ground. And you call yourselves woke. Well, wakey, wakey. To the zombie schoolchildren who have deserted their classrooms to regurgitate half-understood pseudo-scientific pap about saving the planet, I say this: get back to school. The planet was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and as we have just proven, it does not need to be saved again. To you, Mr. President, here in your own hotel, I say this: once the eminent scientists here have verified our result, and if they have found no great fault therein, we shall invite you to be the lead signatory on our letter reporting climatology's error to IPCC, and we shall invite you and your administration to submit it to the IPCC under their error recording protocol on our behalf and on behalf of the working people of the whole world. Imagine how uncomfortable our result will be for the hard-left Democrats who have threatened to make global warming the central plank in their 2020 campaign, just as the wheels are falling off the bandwagon. To you, my good friends, I say this: you have stood steadfast in the face of vilification by the totalitarians for daring to question their party line. Well, their party line was wrong from top to bottom and from side to side. It was wrong, it was incorrect. You are vindicated. And to the people of America, I say this: you have stood steadfast in the face, I say this: reject the Green New Deal, death, tyranny, and the enforcement of misery. Recall your founding fathers' great vision. Vote for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. From sea to shining sea, let freedom ring again.